Coming up, what happened to the people who went down with the Titanic? Was the Titanic disaster actually predicted 14 years before the accident? Who was the person who knew about these mountains but deliberately kept it a secret? Soon we will look at all of these and much more. If you've subscribed and taken your place, then we can get started. The incredible mysteries about the Titanic. It was the largest ship afloat and the most magnificent of them all. The ship's officers and crew were among the best of the Royal Navy, and the passenger cabins surpassed the first-class hotels of the day. It was the largest and most luxurious ship in history, said to be unsinkable. Even if 9 compartments were flooded, the ship could still float. This made it an almost unsinkable ship. If this story sounds familiar to you, wait, because these sentences are from the introduction of a novel written 14 years before the Titanic disaster. Morgan Robertson's 1898 short novel Futurity, also known as The Wreck of the Titan. The novel told the story of a luxury passenger ship named Titan that struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. Contrary to what is believed, this is not a legend or a fabrication. Such a book really exists, and an original copy is kept in the Harvard Library. We mentioned that the name of the ship was Titan, but the really interesting things are about to begin. Page 4. Even though it was April, the weather was cold. The Titanic also sank in April, and even though it was April, the weather was really cold. Page 26. A cry coming from the crow's nest echoed in the air. His eyes shouted, "Ice! There's an iceberg ahead, right under the bow." The ship hit the iceberg on the starboard side. The iceberg cut Titan's keel like a razor. If the impact had been a head-on collision with the iceberg, it couldn't have caused more damage than the injuries from the jolt, and it could have been overcome. The Titanic also struck the iceberg on the starboard side, and its keel was cut like a razor. That's how it sank. In addition to all this, the novel mentioned that the ship was traveling across the Atlantic, and it also included the port of New York as one of its stops. Of course, there are also many differences between these two stories in the novel. However, the fact that both boilers were in the Atlantic Ocean in a cold April, the names of the ships, and the way they collided were eerily similar. Ultimately, even today, the reason for these coincidences has not been clearly explained. The newspapers ran this headline, "More than 1,200 missing." On April 17, a steamship based in Halifax set out and reached the site where the ship sank. Here, they conducted searches for bodies over a large area. They stayed there until April 26 and managed to recover 306 bodies from the surface of the sea. The death toll reached 1,514, with over 1,200 people still missing. Most of them had obviously been pulled into the depths of the sea. Can you imagine yourself in the place of their families? A loved one or a relative of yours dies in this accident, and you don't know where their body is. You can't even hold a proper funeral for them. That's why the families wanted them to be found, no matter what. It was impossible to return their bodies to their families because the bodies were about 4,000 meters below the surface of the sea. But some ideas came to their minds, like underwater photography technology. They considered photographing, exploring the seabed, and recovering the bodies. For example, the footage from a film made in 1916 is one of the first videos showing underwater scenes. This underwater footage, which could only be filmed for 9 minutes, is like the ancestor of today's underwater documentaries. Anyway, their goal was to be able to capture images of those in the wreck like this. Of course, when we think about it now, that was a bit of an optimistic approach for that time. Eventually, very different and utopian ideas started to be considered in order to capture images underwater, like creating a system with ladders, another system where you go underwater and a light helps with photography, or a telescopic system that can go down to the depths as imagined by the Williamson brothers. In fact, they even considered whether they could bring Titan up to the surface. Of course, all of these attempts failed. In the following years, in August 1934, an underwater camera system was designed to make a film called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. With this system designed from cast iron, they managed to descend 928 meters below the surface. But this was still nowhere near the point where Titan was located. The families had completely lost hope by now. Still, the question was whether the deceased were still there. In the 1980s, technology had advanced and various methods had started to be tried. The wreck of the Titanic still hadn't been found. They narrowed down the search area quite a bit by looking at the last coordinates from the Titanic. Then they started scanning 80% of this area. But it was disappointing. They didn't get any results. Another team wanted to scan and investigate the remaining small area. Just when all hope was about to be lost, they managed to find the wreckage.
Fantastic. All right.
Boiler, yes. I'm sure it's a boiler, I see it.
But during the searches, instead of the skeletons of the bodies, they found their clothes and shoes. There was no trace of them left. In fact, the bodies had already disintegrated completely in just 10 years. Because at a depth of 4,000 meters, the lack of antacids like calcium carbonate caused human bones to disappear in a short time. After Titan II sank, an investigation into the accident was launched, and some answers were needed. For example, one of the questions on people's minds was why the ship didn't slow down after the iceberg warning was given. The ship's speed before hitting the iceberg was almost at full speed. Lord Mersey, who conducted the investigation, had taken many notes, and in one of them, he wrote the following. There was no rapid decrease in speed after the warnings. Despite the iceberg warnings, the Titanic was moving at full speed. Later, the main reason for this was shown to be J. Bruce, the chairman of the board of White Star Line. He was also traveling on the Titanic at that time. The reason why the iceberg warning I mentioned in the first video was not delivered to the captain was probably Ismay. Thinking about his company and reputation, Ismay didn't want the ship to slow down because the rival Cunard Company's ships were already fast. Also, if the Titanic traveled slowly during the voyage, it could lose its reputation because of the travel time. He preferred to arrive on time rather than arrive safely. When looking at the notes and data, this theory seemed quite realistic. If the warnings had been heeded and the captain had considered them and slowed down, Titanic would probably have been able to maneuver more easily because it was going at a slower speed before hitting the iceberg, and the accident would never have happened. As more in-depth research was done about the Titanic, it became clear that this was not an ordinary accident, and that there were major acts of negligence. The Titanic's design included planning the number and positions of lifeboats, which was one act of negligence. Although there should have been 48 lifeboats on the ship, Bruce Ismay thought the lifeboats created visual clutter and reduced their number to the minimum required. According to the regulations issued in 1894, the number of lifeboats required on ships was determined not by passenger capacity, but by the ship's weight and volume. So, according to the regulations, the number of lifeboats required to be on the Titanic was 16. There was no regulation against having enough lifeboats on ships to carry all passengers and crew. However, since it would be less expensive and leave more open space on the deck, shipping companies complied with the existing regulations and carried lifeboats based on weight and volume. On the Titanic, there were a total of 20 lifeboats, 16 wooden and 4 collapsible, with a total capacity of 1,178 passengers. Moreover, another mistake was that the lifeboats were not filled to their full capacity. Many lifeboats were launched with dozens of empty seats remaining. If the lifeboats had been at full capacity, the lives of 468 more people could have been saved. Bruce Ismay would escape the disaster by boarding one of the lifeboats he had personally decided to reduce. Let me tell you something else interesting. The novel, published 14 years before the accident I mentioned at the beginning, said the following on its second page. The unsinkable ship Titan carried enough lifeboats to satisfy the law. It's really eerie that even this part of the novel resembles the Titanic. Bruce Ismay both reduced the number of lifeboats and caused a disaster by making the ship go faster, which led to it hitting the iceberg. Ismay was not found guilty by the court, but 25 years later, after fainting and going blind, he would suffer a severe stroke and lose his life. The official accident report in 1912 stated that the iceberg created a 91-meter-long gash on the starboard side of the ship's hull. According to them, the iceberg had created a massive gash in the ship. That was the only way the ship could have sunk. According to eyewitnesses, that is, the survivors from the ship, it took about 2.5 hours for the ship to sink. A 91-meter-long gash would have sunk the Titanic in half an hour. When experts looked at the ultra-high-resolution images of the Titanic created by taking thousands of recent photographs, they saw something interesting. The traces of where the iceberg cut through the hull. This was incredible. When you look closely, you can see that the cut is much smaller, about 8 or 9 meters. Ocean water entered the ship through this leak, but much more slowly than through normal cracks. This also clarifies why the ship took around 2.5 hours to fully sink. James Cameron, the director of the Titanic movie, achieved a first in 2003 by filming parts of the Titanic that had never been explored before. This is the crow's nest, where the iceberg was first spotted. In other words, the lookout tower. The iceberg that sank the Titanic was spotted from right here. Here are the magnificent grand staircases, the place where Jack and Rose meet at the end of the movie. But now, there's nothing left of its magnificence. The place where first-class wealthy passengers dined and chatted. The lounge window is still as vibrant as it was back then. The plates they used for their last meal. The kitchen staff. Once they worked here at the very bottom of the ship, they were the first to die. Those outside the ship are just as tragic as those inside. A shoe with its laces still tightly tied, and when he died, his shoes were still on his feet. Just imagine your body being eaten by sea creatures at the bottom of the ocean. The only thing left behind is your skeleton, which quickly disappears, and all that's left of you are your shoes. The Titanic isn't just something you can dismiss as just a shipwreck. There are many mysteries, terrifying events, and heartbreaking stories. Just like the shoes of this 19-month-old baby. He was just one of the babies who drowned in their final moments. And today we see a part of him. The Titanic, which was said to be unsinkable even by God, had sunk. For these people, it was a nightmare, a disaster. But for the lobsters waiting for death in the kitchen, it was a miracle. And miracles come suddenly.